go from there. Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. My name is Seth Spencer. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Teach Climate Network coordinator for Climate Generation, a climate change education nonprofit based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but really working with educators and communities across the nation. Through this virtual workshop series, we're going to be bringing the best practices of climate change education to you and really creating opportunities for you to connect with a professional community of climate change leaders and educators. I, of course, will be sharing this slide deck, this recording, and links to resources in a follow-up email. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I'm going to do my best to kind of keep an eye on the chat as we go. So if there is anything that you are kind of wondering, Seth, what are you talking about? Feel free to throw it in the chat. That's going to be the best way as we go forward. And in all of the presentations that Climate Generation does, we do try to make these interactive. I will be asking you questions that, again, the chat's probably the best way, but if you're not able to interact in the chat, you can always come off mute. And so, yeah, thanks so much for joining me tonight. This is Exploring Climate Change Through Extreme Weather Phenomena. And Climate Generation does begin every presentation that we lead with a land acknowledgement. We take time to acknowledge the native land we are on because one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be really easy to forget that we are still occupying land and that Indigenous individuals and communities are still alive and leading change in our world. We also recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities, and we seek to raise up their voices in climate change education. Climate Generation is incredibly proud of the diversity of our country, and we know that our vision for an equitable future can only be achieved when people are working together, bridging experience and expertise from across the globe. So who is Climate Generation? We hope that all of our presentations, again, live into our vision of igniting and sustaining the ability of educators, youth, and communities to act on the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. And we hopefully will accomplish this through three overarching strategies, which you can see here: of overcoming disinformation, centering anti-racism and systemic equity, and personalizing and localizing climate change action. So I always want to know, why are folks here? Why did you take time in your afternoon and evening to join me? So what are you hoping to get out of the workshop? Just throw a quick response in the chat if you can. I'll give folks about 45 seconds, a minute, just to kind of see what are folks hoping to get out of the experience. Love it. Knowledge. A new hook to add to my climate change unit. Partnerships in education. Oh, great. Ideas for engaging students, resources to share with other educators. Definitely hope to provide some resources through our time together tonight. Content knowledge, perfect. Yeah, feel free to keep throwing things in there. I love it. So tonight, hopefully the flow is going to be really how do changes in climate and weather impact our land and communities, with a bit of a basis in some climate science and why that matters to extreme weather. Exploring the phenomenon of extreme weather to begin to answer this question, and then really connecting it back to the classroom, whether that be a formal, informal classroom, of how do you get your students to care, to be aware of these phenomena, and really connect them to possibly taking climate action. So you probably have seen this graph numerous times before, but I always like to show it because there is always, I think it's helpful to connect students to, okay, we know that for the last 140 years, there has been an increase in the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, and mostly due to carbon dioxide, and that's directly linked to an increase in temperature. And some students might ask, well, why does that matter? And so I'm going to ask you a question. of the last, or from data in the last 140 years, how many of the top 10 hottest years on record have occurred in the last decade? So, of all the data that we have from the last 140 years of global temperature, how many of the top 10 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 10 years or last decade? So I'm seeing some great, so 9, 10, all of them, 9, all 10, all of them. I think at 7, maybe 7 or 8. So I love that we have a well-informed group. And this might be a little depressing, but all 10 have occurred in the last 10 years, with 2023 last year being the hottest year ever recorded globally. And the reason that I bring this up, not to like depress every student that I ever connect with these resources, is that if you have a 10-year-old student in your class, they have experienced the 10 hottest years on record for the climate data that we have. And so what can be challenging is that this is not a change for them. This is their reality. This is what they are experiencing. And so maybe if you're 30, 40, 50 up, you have seen those changes, but it's harder for a student who this is their lived experience to really try to get any of that. Okay. So I'm going to ask you another question. Okay. What does extreme weather mean to you? All right. Because you'll hear that really talking about that personal experience is really important. Okay, so we've got good old Sharknado, weather caused by the climate crisis. And yes, that is exactly right. Depends on where you are, which is why I'm asking you. So I want to know where you are. What does that mean to you? Stronger and more frequent hurricanes and heat days, exactly, raised insurance rates. We'll talk about that in a little bit. More intense and frequent extreme weather, such as tornadoes, blizzards, hurricanes. Awesome. Lack of snow or deep snow. Yeah, these really extreme differences. Wonderful. So I think when I do presentations, I find that it is incredibly helpful and powerful to talk with students or any audience about my climate story. So A, why am I doing this work? B, why do I care? And C, I think it really helps students realize that climate change is happening to them. And so I don't know if I mentioned it in my little introduction, but I am from Duluth, Minnesota, a small city in northern Minnesota, and lived there growing up, but then lived kind of all over the place. And before moving back to Minnesota, I lived in coastal Alaska. I lived in Homer, Alaska for 5 years. And so while in those 5 years, I was not seeing drastic climate changes, what I was finding was community members that during their lifetime had noticed extreme changes, whether that be from salmon migration, bird migration timing, or probably the most extreme were glaciers melting. So this is a glacier just about 45 minutes east of Anchorage, Alaska. And you can see that in the last 110 years, or in this picture, 90 years, that glacier has receded. It's hard to tell from this picture, but that glacier has receded 5 miles. And so I think that's what students often think of when they think of climate change. They think of glaciers melting. They think of polar bears in trouble. They think of possibly sea level rise, because that's often what is shared in media. It's what's shared in movies. So I moved back to Minnesota about 4 years ago, and I'm not gonna lie, for the first 6 months, year, I struggled a little bit to how to make climate change relatable to myself, but to the audiences that I was working with, because we weren't seeing glaciers. Most people that I interact with have never seen a polar bear. Not super worried about sea level rise. And so this is where I ask you, what is extreme weather for you? Because it's really important for us as educators to find what is going to connect to our audience. So for me here in Minnesota, it is floods, extreme precipitation events, extreme rain. So you'll see a picture here of a gas station flooded out. Now, does anybody know why? This is a very local question. So if you live outside of Minnesota, you probably would have no idea about this, but it did make national media. Why did I share a picture of a seal. And what is it? It's hard to tell, I'm sure, but what is the seal doing? It does relate to my climate story, but any guesses in the chat of what the heck that seal is doing? So that seal does look quite surprised, and it's probably hard to tell, but just behind the seal is a car. Those are car lights. Yes, very good. So the Duluth Zoo flooded out in 2012, so 12 years ago, and the seal got out and was kind of flopping around the street. The polar bear in the zoo also got out, but luckily stayed within the zoo enclosure. And the reason I mention that is that happened in a once in 100-year flood event. Well, that was 12 years ago. Duluth, since then, has experienced two more once in 100-year flood events. And so when we think of extreme weather, I'll talk about where we're seeing those connections between an extreme weather event and climate change. But one of the more extreme, it's not the most extreme, but one of the more extreme is going to be things like extreme precipitation, where we're getting a once in a, I think I saw yesterday, Europe is getting a once in 1,000-year storm. Well, I have seen that headline hundreds of times in the last few years alone. But I think that's going to be probably one of the biggest things. And so when we think of extreme weather here in the United States, often what we are seeing is floods. We're also seeing record-breaking snow in California from a few years ago. The worst outbreak of tornadoes ever for March back in 2022. Hurricane Ian, powerful storm sweeping through Florida and causing extreme coastal flooding. Or again from 2021 and 2022, major heat waves breaking records repeatedly on the West Coast. Or to even predictions of what extreme weather is going to be like in the future. So if you've not experienced Climate Central graphics before, they are pretty amazing. They do some really good in-depth data in specific cities. One of is Chicago, Minneapolis has a few. But I'll show this very, very shortly, but one of the most extreme weather events is going to be extreme heat. So, and especially in cities where there's already urban heat islands or urban heat spots, people in these cities are going to be most impacted. And so when we think about who is going to be impacted, well, everybody's going to be impacted, but often it's people in large cities, or we'll look at a few graphs here shortly, people often even in rural areas that don't have maybe the same resources. So extreme weather events, are they becoming more common in the last 2 decades, or are we just forgetting about the past of severe weather events in the last 100 years? Well, again, using data, Climate Central, yeah, thanks so much for putting that in there, Heather, shows us that there has been an increase specifically for extreme precipitation events over the last 60 years, especially in the Midwest and Northeast regions. So we'll have an opportunity to talk about these extreme weather events here shortly, but it's also important to think about, okay, so we have an extreme weather event, and of course the people that live in that community are impacted, but whether it be the United States, Canada, really any country in the world, we are also directly impacted, unfortunately, economically. And I think that can be another area when we often talk about climate change, we're talking in science, but again, that social impact. So NOAA keeps track of some great data around weather and climate disasters. Over the last 40 years, there was an average of $8 billion disasters per year related to weather and climate disasters. So 2022, so 2 years ago, had 18. 2023 had 28. And here in 2024, we are only in the middle of September, and really they've only done data through the end of August. We already have had $20 billion weather and climate disasters here in the United States. And you can dive into the data. It's really interesting. One of the reasons that we are having more is that things have become more expensive. So when we have a hurricane or a severe weather outbreak such as tornadoes, it is more expensive to rebuild. But also we have to be thinking about, why are they becoming more common? But we'll do a little bit of trivia here. Does anybody have a guess which state, and you can use your context clues by looking at this graph, but which state has had the most billion-dollar weather disasters in the 42 years that NOAA has been keeping track? So which state in the United States? We are getting some wonderful guesses of Texas, Florida, Texas, Florida. Well, it is very helpful to look at this graph, apparently, because most groups don't get there right away. It is Texas. And Texas has had $170 billion weather disasters in the last 40 years. You can sort of see why that might be. Texas is large. There's a lot of people there, but it gets impacted by severe weather, such as tornadoes and hail. It gets impacted by droughts. It gets impacted by hurricanes. Okay, now does anybody have a guess which state has had the least billion-dollar weather disasters? That's a good question, Stacey. I don't know if landslides would be included. My guess is that it would be part of a larger storm. And so it might just be called like an extreme precipitation event. So I'm seeing Hawaii, I'm seeing Maine, I'm seeing Arizona, Vermont, Wyoming. And this is good that people are guessing states that have low populations, because that's a big part of this. If you have a low population, an extreme storm comes through, doesn't cost that much to rebuild, things like that. But it is Hawaii. Hawaii has had $2 billion weather disasters, and one occurred just last year with the extreme fire event. And I think it's interesting to talk about this with students, partly of where are regions that are impacted the most. This graph shows it, or this map shows it a little bit. This is just in the last 23 years, but all of those billion-dollar weather disasters, you can see they're really, again, Texas, but the Southeast. Hurricanes are probably the most damaging of these, but any of those severe, like those tornado systems that are moving through, extremely impactful. Okay, at this point, you might say, cool, Seth, you've told me a lot about extreme weather. What the heck does that have to do with climate change? Because that is often where we see in media is that, well, we get extreme weather events all the time. What does that have to do with climate change? And that is a great question about fire. And I think I can go back to probably 2024. My guess is that those fires of the last 2 years haven't yet caused $1 billion of damage. And it could be that they're only looking at data to like houses and communities, maybe not for rebuilding forests. When I know if you go back to 2021 and 2022, those extreme fire events in California, Idaho, Oregon, Washington do show up. But that's a really good kind of question about what are they looking at? Yeah. Okay, so let's look at that connection between climate change and extreme weather, because this is really tricky. Climate and weather forecasting, modeling, all of that is really difficult. So we leave it up to climatologists, climate scientists that study this. And what climate scientists have found through climate modeling is that there is evidence that supports a strong link between human-caused climate change and certain extreme weather events. And there is limited evidence to connect climate change to extreme weather events for other things. So as I mentioned, heat waves. We've seen the data. Increased carbon dioxide is increasing the temperature. So heat waves are definitely going to be connected. With that increased temperature, we get more precipitation, more moisture, and we get flooding, glaciers and ice packs. And so we get increased coastal flooding. With that, again, that increased temperature, more moisture in the atmosphere. So extreme precipitation events. along with that, winter storms. And then this is, I think, slightly newer in the last 5 years, stronger connection to more severe droughts, which a lot of students struggle with. I struggled with a little bit to have to look at that data. How do we at this one time get more rain in a lot of places in a short amount of time, but also higher likelihood of droughts? Unfortunately, we're seeing both of those happen around the world, but especially here in the United States. Where we're seeing kind of that moderate to less evidence is hurricanes. And this is a time, if anybody has either more knowledge around that connection, because climatologists are always updating this. But I know with hurricanes, what I have, I guess, researched is that we don't necessarily see a connection between more hurricanes due to climate change. What we are seeing a connection is to the rate or the pace at which those hurricanes escalate from either a tropical storm or a category 1 to a category 3 and 4. And so I know hurricanes in the last 3 or 4 years have actually set records for how fast, how quickly they went from a category 1 to a category 3 and 4. And that's really important because communities don't have the opportunity to plan in the same way. And I am now realizing that I skipped over a small thing at the very beginning. And this is really important for myself, for you all, and definitely for your students, that talking about extreme weather events can be incredibly traumatizing. It can bring up some pretty raw emotions if you or your community has experienced an extreme weather event. So I think it's something to just keep in mind when bringing up with students, and I apologize for going over that pretty quickly. But it's, I think, important for us to be aware is that an extreme weather event is probably the number one way that our students, our communities are interacting or being aware of climate change. Again, they might see in a movie about the ice caps melting and polar bears being in trouble, but the way they're experiencing it are heat waves and droughts and flooding and possibility of stronger hurricanes. So we are now going to transition a little bit to, okay, we've talked about extreme weather. We've seen that link a little bit between climate change and extreme weather. And now we're going to look at what is one way you can use a phenomena or like a specific event to make that connection with a student. And so this is where it's going to become very personal to me because I've tried this a couple different ways. I've looked at an extreme weather event that I've never experienced. And I found a little, like, it didn't feel authentic in the same way. So we are going to look at an extreme weather event that occurred in Duluth, Minnesota. So as I mentioned, that is where I grew up. You can see Duluth is a city of about 85,000 people on the western shore of Lake Superior, which is the largest freshwater lake in the world. Now, give a little bit of context. Duluth started out as an industrial mecca, moving timber, wheat, and iron ore from Minnesota and North and South Dakota eastward to where a lot of the population was. But like many cities, these industries faded, and Duluth had a population that was declining, and the economy was really struggling in the 70s, 80s, and early 1990s. But let's fast forward a little bit. In the late 1990s, Duluth started a revitalization effort, which was based on tourism and has since been listed numerous times in Outdoor Magazine as a top 10 outdoor destination city. Recently, Duluth has also been described by the New York Times, the BBC, CNN as a climate haven or a climate refugee destination, which is really interesting when we talk about what we're going to talk about here in a second. So this is the Duluth Harbor. That image of the boat, the ship, is off to the left in this picture. And over here in the right, I removed my arrow, unfortunately, but on the right next to the water, you can see a small path. and that is known as the Lake Walk. It is probably the #1 visited destination in Duluth. It's about a 5-mile paved path along Lake Superior. And so here is a look back at the famous lift bridge. And again, you can see that walking path, and you can see an old building out in the lake. And I tell you all this to give you a little bit of context of how we're going to talk about a phenomena which happens quite often in Duluth, but how a community kind of dealt with this. So again, this is part of my climate story, but I also wanted to set the stage for a short jump into how to use an extreme weather phenomena to talk about climate change impacts and mitigation. So I'm going to hopefully show a video here. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to hear it. I'm going to share it for maybe a minute, but let's see if this works.
Canal Park is currently flooding right now, so I'm gonna go get some footage before they probably close this down.
Okay, so as you can see, this was during a storm that was causing localized flooding in Duluth right along that bike path. And it doesn't show it here, but that bike path was destroyed and caused not billions, but $1 million of damage to the #1 destination in Duluth. Now, I know we have other folks from the Midwest that might live close to a Great Lake here on the call, and you might say, Seth, storms happen all the time, especially in October, November. Lake Superior especially is kind of legendary for having extreme weather or extreme waves that can cause damage. So again, why does that matter? What does that have to do with climate change? Well, I'll share some links and resources here in a second, but again, you may be aware that all of the Great Lakes, but especially Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, just in the last 10 years have recorded the highest water levels they've ever recorded. And that is, you might think, okay, it's a huge lake. Why does that matter so much? And how could it possibly change? But when we're getting these extreme precipitation events or extreme rains, even though these lakes are huge, they can actually go up year to year, sometimes 1 to 2 feet, which again might not seem like a lot, but as we're seeing along the coast, at 1 to 2 feet, when we get storms, can really cause pretty crazy damage. So we are now going to move over to our case study section. And I think this is going to work out with the size group we have. In just a minute, I'm going to be sending folks into some very short 10 to 15 minute breakout rooms. And I know for some of you, you're like, great, I get to have a conversation. Some are like, oh dear, I want nothing to do with a breakout room. I'm going to try to make them large enough that you can have a little bit of a conversation, meet a few other educators. But to get that started, I'm going to share the link to this slide deck just so you don't have to remember exactly what I am telling you right now. You'll have access to this slide deck. And right now I'm on like slide 27, if you're able to click in there. And then what I'm going to make sure I do is share a link to a news article about that storm that destroyed the lake walk. And you can see a picture here of what happened. That path is under a large amount of rock. And this article is going to go a little bit into depth of how the city of Duluth, mostly the city administration, reacted, because these storms, as I mentioned, have been happening year after year for hundreds of years. But Duluth decided they were going to build a tourist destination right next to an area just semi-similar to what happens on the East Coast, especially in North Carolina, where we have built houses in an area that always is going to get storm damage. And so how something like just a foot or two of a higher lake level or a few inches of a higher ocean can have a pretty extreme impact. And so what I'm gonna have you do is you're gonna read that article. And I know that like if you don't get through the whole thing, that's okay. There's just a couple paragraphs where it talks a little bit about what the city did. And so I'm going to have you can introduce yourselves. You can read that case study for just a few minutes. And then I'm going to have you actually uh, discuss a little bit about, again, what factors, you can probably skip that part. We've talked about it a little bit more, but what are the environmental and social impacts of an extreme weather event? And possibly how would I connect my students to that? And so definitely understand if folks aren't able to stay through this whole part. I'll probably give everybody about 15 minutes to read, have that conversation, and I'll bring people back. And I will definitely be recording. I'm going to pause the recording as we go into breakout rooms. But before I send people out, does anybody have any questions? Hopefully you've got that slide deck. You've got that article. But I'm not seeing it. I'm going to just stop sharing. And also pause the recording here. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for taking that time to read through. I know it was probably a very short amount of time to get through, but read through that a little bit. And then also, there we go. But also just share a little bit about how you could possibly use something like this or similar to this back to connecting your students to extreme weather events and climate change. Just due to timing, I'm not going to have us share out too much right now, but in that Q&A time, I might ask if anybody wants to share kind of what they talked about, but I'll give you a little bit of update of kind of what has happened in Duluth. So what I was showing you happened in about 2019 to 2020, and then in 2021, Duluth rebuilt that entire Lake Walk area in preparation for more and maybe more severe fall and winter storms. And so if you've had it, I know some of you are, again, live in the Midwest, and some of you might have been to Duluth recently, but this is kind of what it looks like now. And so again, there probably will still be issues, but the city has hoped that they've kind of set it up, maybe spent a little bit more money now to hopefully not have to rebuild in the future. So when we talk about resources, it can always kind of be challenging of what are we actually sharing with our students and with communities. And so the ones that I've shared here are mostly for K-12 students, but there can be still some really great resources. I always recommend folks check out Yale Climate Connections program, as they just have some really amazing kind of visual data around climate change and climate change opinions. The National Center for Science Education also has some great resources of really how to talk about climate science in the classroom, especially in areas where talking about climate change can be challenging. National Geographic Education, again, has some great information for educators to bring climate science, but just really climate change, again, in the classroom. And then NASA Climate Kids has some, again, great resources. And as I mentioned, I will be sending an email in the next couple of days with all the resources that I've mentioned, the recording, and some follow-up information. I did mention that this is just one of 9 workshops that Climate Generation is going to be presenting over the school year. And so our next one here in October, we're going to be changing a little bit and really looking at how to talk about climate change with early elementary students. And so my colleague Marie Fargo will be presenting. I'll just throw the link in the chat. Of course, I will be sending all of this registration information later, but just want to share that now. And then another opportunity that I want to share is that especially if you live in the Midwest, this is part of a larger project to talk about climate change and how it impacts the Midwest. And so The Midwest Climate Collaboration has an educator community of practice, and they're going to actually be partnering with some of our workshops to actually talk about how do we bring this into the classroom. And I'll, again, send all of this in a follow-up email. But you can actually join a community of educators to talk about how do we actually do this in practice. So yes, Seth, it's great to talk about extreme weather, but how do we actually bring that and connect it back to sometimes the requirements of what you have to actually teach as a formal teacher? And with that, I am done sharing all my information, and definitely want to open it up to questions that folks have, comments. If you want to share something you talked about in that breakout space. But thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so we can actually see each other a little bit better. But feel free to throw any questions you might have in the chat. This is the time you can definitely come off mute if you have a question. But also, if you need to head out, thank you so much for joining me this evening. And hopefully you can join us in the future.
Hey, Seth, with that thing in April this year, or coming up next year, rather,
Yes.
are you guys inviting back like all of the folks from when was that? June? When we presented with our states for like the Wisconsin Climate Fellowship and all that?
Yeah, so I think what you're specifically talking about is the Midwest Climate Collaborative Summit that will be happening at the end of April in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, you got a doctor that can write me a note just in case? I'm feeling
and
poorly.
we actually do have the director of the Midwest Climate Collaborative on the call, Heather, if you want to say anything about it. But I think what you were asking is, are we going to connect what Climate Generation did with the Summer Institute and the great educators or teachers that participate in that? Is there a way to get folks to show up to that? And the answer is yes. That is definitely one of our goals. Thanks so much for putting that link in there, Heather. I don't know if I have anything specific at the moment, but that is definitely something Climate Generation and the Midwest Climate Collaborative will be following up. Oh yeah, thanks, Heather. That's awesome. So yeah, if you and anything that Keep is doing or Subject Climate is doing would be a good connection for the summit. It looks like Heather's saying there's accepting proposals, but I'll try to include that in my follow-up email as well.
Awesome. You happen to have any information for COP29 in Baku? I volunteer to go.
I know that we did send out kind of application opportunities a couple of weeks ago. I'll have to follow up with my colleagues to see if we're still offering that.
I did not see that come in my email, and I get your email.
As I know, we do have some folks heading there in just a month or so.
Yeah, I didn't get that email either. That would have been interesting to go.
And I will say I don't lead our conference of parties program. And so I don't off the top of my head know if we sent out a mass thing or if we did maybe a little bit more direct outreach to folks. But I'll connect with my colleague who leads that program and see if there's still space, but I'll try to follow up with that in a follow-up email. So
well, and specific, I'm more interested personally in Madison actually. So
okay. Yeah. I'll follow up with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any other questions about?
I'd love to go international, but I get it.
Just out of curiosity, Seth, do you have something on damage control? Because a lot of my folks, when you go talking, they'll say, but the Americans are the worst one. They don't believe it exists. Now, how do you deal with that? Is there a way you could come up with some damage control where if somebody says something anti, you can debunk that? Because I know a lot of your politicians, and we have seen you withdrawing from international conferences on this, and that actually has got a major impact on even our own teaching, because people will say, but the ones who are actually creating the problem are refusing that it doesn't exist.
Wow, that is an excellent question. And I know that we have some amazing climate change education and climate leaders on the call as well. So if anybody wants to throw any resources in the chat, I have my own opinions and what we attempt to do for climate generation. But of course, if anybody else has any thoughts, because I think what you said is definitely true. The United States is one of the, I mean, we're the largest historical emitter, probably number 2 or 3 currently, depending on which data you look at. And so how do you have those conversations with maybe just your community, but especially the folks that are making the decisions, and especially at an international level when we aren't maybe doing what we need to do at something like the Conference of the Parties. And yeah, I'm going to pass it over to, I don't know if it's, feel free to introduce yourself, the person with your hand raised. I think you're on unmute.
It's Jamin.
Okay, thanks, Jamin.
Hi, great question. And one of our frustrations as educators, but what I've learned in answer to your question is we don't have time to argue like what is changing our climate. So a lot of the people who think that it isn't real is because we feel guilty that we as humans are being told that we caused it. I feel like we need to get beyond that and say no matter what is causing it, it's real. And how are we going to move forward with it? That gets you one step beyond that, the negativity. And that makes it a dialogic conversation. The one other thing I would say from folks from the Midwest and any place that there's agriculture is that, for example, here in Missouri is an agricultural state. I guarantee you that the farmers, family farmers, know that something's changing and they're doing something about it. So there are now movements within rural areas and places that people don't necessarily get into the politics of climate change, but they're living it. And those are the people that we are now really, really getting on board in our organization to help us move forward with what are we going to do about it, not what's causing it. So I don't know if that helps, Vitalis, with your question, but it's been helping me have conversations with people.
No. I hear you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
And I'll just
You're
add,
welcome.
with Michael's resource that, yeah, I mean, the data that we're seeing is that a majority of Americans do believe that climate change is happening, that it's human caused. And I definitely agree that you don't have to worry or know that it's human caused to do something about it, but we know that that mitigation, so reducing what we're currently emitting, is key, but so is the adapting to it. And that's a little bit of what I was showing tonight, was that adapting. But of course, we do still need to look at how are we reducing that. And I think that's probably the key thing of how do we, as a huge emitter, get us to actually make those changes. And there have been some huge wins, but if, again, we're not seeing that in an international level, or the international community is not seeing them as huge wins, that's a problem too. But I know it unfortunately it's pretty fractured. Like Minnesota, we've got a lot of big wins, but that's not true in every region. But that is why it's important to talk about what are some of the similarities that's happening maybe in the Midwest or the Southeast, East Coast, all of these places. And again, it's building, and it can be challenging because it might not feel like it's building fast enough, but it is building that action. Yeah. And I mean, it's a little scary when you actually look at some of the data of, like, I just participated in a climate health conversation for Africa, and how the data at least was saying, okay, the global data is only a degree or 2 Celsius, but in certain regions, it's 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in the 40 or 50 years that we're really seeing those increases, and how impactful that can be. And so looking at a global temperature piece is helpful, but it is really localized as well in some places. I know that it is top of the hour, and so I don't want to keep anybody. I will stay on for a few more minutes, but overall, just want to thank so much for everybody joining me this evening, or for some of you, maybe the morning. But again, hope you can join us in the future, and I'll send those additional resources in the next couple of days. And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. But thanks, everybody.
Seth, is that